The time is 8:34. We're going back on the record. This is tape 1 of day 2 of the deposition of Bill Gates.
Good morning, Mr. Gates. Are you going to be a witness at the trial of this matter?
Objection.
I don't know.
Do you intend to be a witness at the trial of this matter?
Objection to this line of questioning. Witness list comes out next week. There's a court order in place on this.
Yes, but I think I'm entitled to ask a witness whether he intends to appear at trial. You people certainly have done that with witnesses. I think it's a common question. If you instruct him not to answer, you can instruct him not to answer.
I haven't done that. I've posed an objection.
Do you intend to be a witness at trial?
I don't know.
All right. And the purpose, obviously, was because if we knew whether he was going to be a witness at trial, that might shorten and change the examination. It's a common question. I don't know why you object to it. Mr. Gates, when did you first become concerned about the competitive threat that Netscape posed to Microsoft?
I know by late '95, we were thinking of Netscape as one of our many competitors. So I think it would have been around then.
When did you first become concerned about the competitive threat that Java posed to Microsoft?
Well, Java as a computer language does not pose a competitive threat to Microsoft. There's some runtime work that various companies are doing with different APIs, including Sun, that represent platform competition. So you have to be careful how you talk about Java.
Do you talk about Java as a competitive threat to Microsoft, Mr. Gates?
There's a lot of documents and understanding inside Microsoft that Java, the language, which if you take the term Java on the face of it and in some contexts is what it refers to, that's not a competitive threat. In fact, we are the leading vendor of Java language development tools. Sometimes in the right context, when people use that term, they're talking about various runtime activities, but you have to look pretty carefully at the context.
My question right now doesn't go to what various people within Microsoft have said or believe. My question goes to what you have said. Have you referred to Java as a competitive threat to Microsoft?
The Java runtime activities are a competitive threat to Microsoft. Java itself is not. So if I use the term Java, that way I'm careful to make sure people know I'm talking about the runtime piece.
Have you sometimes, as a shorthand, referred to Java as opposed to what you now say as the Java runtime activities as a competitive threat to Microsoft?
I may have if I made it clear what I meant.
And by making it clear what you meant, can you explain what you mean by that?
To draw the distinction between Java, the language, and the runtime activities around Java, the APIs being created there by various companies.
Have you received email from people that describe Java as a competitive threat to Microsoft?
Well, inside Microsoft, the context of the various pieces of Java, including in a lot more detail than I've had a chance to explain to you so far, is well understood. And so we use a lot of shorthands for a lot of things that confuse people who just look at the emails.
Could I have the question read back, please?
Have you received email from people that described Java as a competitive threat to Microsoft?
Under the scenario I described, it's possible that people would do that in email.
When you say under the scenario that I described, what scenario are you talking about?
The scenario is people inside Microsoft who have an understanding of the various pieces of Java who are communicating with each other.
Let me try to be clear that my question does not encompass any scenario. My question is simply, have you received email from people within Microsoft that describe Java as a competitive threat, or assert that Java is a competitive threat to Microsoft?
Objection. You have a very full answer, precise and clear, to that question. The witness may answer again.
Yeah, I've described the circumstances under which it's possible I've gotten an email like that.
My question is not what are the circumstances under which it is possible that that happened. My question is, have you received email from people in Microsoft that assert that Java is a competitive threat to Microsoft?
It's possible there's someone who, having the right context about the pieces that are entailed in Java, may have used that as a shorthand for the piece we consider a competitive threat.
My question is not what is possible, but what you recall. If you don't recall ever receiving an email in which somebody from Microsoft asserted that Java was a competitive threat, that's an answer to my question. You can say yes, no, I don't recall, but
I don't recall a specific piece of mail. I think there's a good chance that I've received mail where somebody used that kind of shorthand.
Now, have you used that kind of shorthand? That is, have you personally asserted that Java is a competitive threat to Microsoft?
Well, I always object to you acting like the assertion stands by itself. There's a shorthand that I've told you about. So no, I've never asserted that statement. We use the term Java in a variety of contexts, and if you want to show me a context, I'll answer. But the assertion on the face of it is wrong unless somebody's using the term Java in a very special way.
What I'm asking you, Mr. Gates, is whether you have used Java in what you describe as the very special way to refer as a shorthand to whatever it is that you believe constitutes a competitive threat to Microsoft.
I don't remember a specific document where I did, but I think it's quite likely that with certain people I use that shorthand.
Okay. When you use Java as a shorthand in describing Java as a competitive threat to Microsoft, am I to understand that what you mean in that context is to refer to what you have described here as the Java runtime activities?
Yeah, if you want to get into what we mean by the shorthand, you'll have to show me a specific context, because sometimes it might mean EJB, sometimes it might just mean the VM, sometimes it might mean AWT, sometimes it might mean JFC. I mean, but I'll be glad to clarify any particular case. You have to have the context.
If necessary, we'll go through each one context by context, although that's obviously a lengthy procedure. But let me see if I can try to get some general principles. When you refer to Java as a competitive threat to Microsoft, what do you mean?
I've told you it depends on the context.
Okay. Why don't you list each of the different things that you mean when you describe Java as a competitive threat to Microsoft?
I don't know what you mean. You're asking me to recall every context where I might have ever used that shorthand?
Well, I'm asking you to tell me every context that you do recall.
I've told you I don't recall any specific document where I've used the shorthand. I can give you several contexts where it's very likely that I have.
If that's the best you can do, let's start with that.
Well, there's the context of server middleware APIs, an EJB discussion, and people who write three-tier applications, what APIs are they likely to develop their applications against?
And why does Java, in your view, represent a competitive threat to Microsoft with respect to server middleware or EJBs?
No, I've told you that Java itself is not the competitive threat. I'm telling you the thing that is the competitive threat. So when you rephrase it to say Java's the competitive threat, that's just the shorthand term. The competitive threat is the APIs in the EJB and the other middleware layers that people are putting together.
Well, Mr. Gates, in your view, does Java play itself any role in what you view as a competitive threat to Microsoft?
Java the language?
Yes, let's start with Java the language.
No.
Okay. When you refer to Java as a competitive threat, why do you use the word Java as shorthand for what you now say doesn't relate to Java?
Objection.
I didn't say that. It certainly relates to Java. Java runtime relates to Java. I mean, give me a break.
Move to strike. The answer is non-responsive.
Objection to the question as grossly misstating the prior testimony.
You can object all you want, but if your object is to get this deposition over with, I would suggest that you make your objections before the question and not as a speech to try to support the witness after the witness begins to engage in that kind of colloquy.
Certainly a short speech, wasn't it?
Mr. Gates, you know perfectly well that you and lots of other people within Microsoft describe Java, J-A-V-A, without talking about runtimes or EJBs or server middleware. Java, J-A-V-A, as a competitive threat. You know that, don't you?
I've told you that when we talk about the Java runtime threat, we often use Java as a shorthand for that. We haven't come up with another term for the Java runtime competitive threat in its various forms.
When did you first become concerned about the Java runtime threat to Microsoft?
There have been a lot of changes in the strategy of Sun and various people. I know there was talk about Java in the second half of '95, but I don't think we really understood what the various people around were doing. Sometime in '96, when Sun was doing its promotion of writing applications strictly to the Java runtime, to their Java runtime, which is one of them. In fact, they have multiple. Then we would have looked at that as something we needed to understand and decide how it affected our strategy.
My question is not when you decided you needed to look at Java to decide something. My question is, when did you first conclude that what you have referred to as the Java runtime threat was a competitive threat to Microsoft?
Objection.
Well, it gets a little complicated because there's some of even the runtime pieces of Java that we support, but there's some things that people are doing in those runtimes that we have a different approach. But that's all, more recent in terms of understanding what our products are going to do.
My question is, when did you first conclude that what you have described as the Java runtime threat was a competitive threat to Microsoft?
I think there was a lot of discussion about what to do with the Java and Java runtime things, and there was a part of what Sun was doing that by late '96 we had decided not there's some extensions they were doing in late '96 that we thought of as competitive.
Do I understand that last answer to be that it would not have been until late 1996 that you considered what you have described as the Java runtime threat as a competitive threat to Microsoft?
Well, you used the word conclude, and there's a long period of time where there's a lot of thinking about Java runtime inside Microsoft where people are going back and forth, and some people will say, hey, this is fine, it's not competitive. Somebody would say, hey, maybe it is competitive. There's a lot of going back and forth. So when you use the term conclude, I assume You're talking about a point at which there's a clear opinion and not just a lot of debate, even, my view being established. And so then I think you've got to go as late 96 before there's much clarity at all.
I think you may have answered the question, but I want to be sure, because my question relates not to what other people were saying within Microsoft, but what you believed. And what I'm trying to find out is when you, Bill Gates, first believed that what you have described as the Java runtime threat was a competitive threat to Microsoft.
Well, you used the word conclude.
Actually, in this last answer, I used the word believe. Or the last question, I used the word believe.
So you're changing the question.
Well, if believe and conclude is different for you, I'll ask it both ways.
Yeah, it's very different. In late
Okay, then let me ask the question so the record is clear what you're
You don't want to let me answer the last one?
Or if that's what you're going to answer, let's read the question back so that we're sure. And would you reincorporate the question so that the record is clear that what follows is intended to be a response to this particular question?
I think you may have answered the question, but I want to be sure, because my question relates not to what other people were saying within Microsoft, but what you believed. And what I'm trying to find out is when you, Bill Gates, first believed that what you have described as the Java runtime threat was a competitive threat to Microsoft.
But in the first part of 96, I was getting a lot of different opinions about Java runtime and what Sun was doing and what we should do. I wouldn't say that I believed firmly that it was a competitive threat, because that all depended on what Sun was doing, what other companies were doing, and what we were going to do. By late 96, I think I had a view that what Sun was doing was a competitive activity.
When you talk about having a view that what Sun was doing was a competitive activity, do you use the term activity to mean the same thing that you meant before when you used the term threat?
Well, you were the one who used the term threat, and I'm not quite sure. It was competitive. Is something that's competitive always a competitive threat? I'm not sure.
Mr. Gates, I think the record will show, and if necessary, we can go back to it, that you used the term Java runtime threat. Do you recall doing that?
Yes.
Okay. Now,
That's not the same as competitive threat.
well, when you use the Java runtime threat phrase, what did you mean by threat?
I meant that it was competitive.
And so you were using, in that context, threat and competitive to mean the same thing?
Yes.
Okay. Now, using threat in the same sense that you were using it to mean competitive, I want to ask what you said was the different question from what you believed. When did you conclude that the Java runtime threat was a competitive threat to Microsoft?
Well, by late 96, I thought of it as competitive.
And when you use the word thought there, are you using it to mean what you have said you meant by believe, as well as what you said you meant by conclude?
I mean, by then, it was pretty clear to me it was another thing we had to think of in terms of the list of the competitors, as opposed to earlier, where I wasn't sure of that.
What did you do to try to respond to what you have described as the Java runtime threat?
The same thing we always do, just innovate in our products and use the customer feedback to delight them so that they choose to license our products.
Did you do anything else to try to respond to what you describe as the Java runtime threat?
Well, we try to understand from customers what they're doing and how our strategy might appeal versus someone else's strategy, and then go back and look at our strategy to see if we can make it better.
Did you do anything else?
I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, our whole activity here, everything we do really comes under what I just described.
Everything Microsoft does comes under what you've just described. Is that your testimony, sir?
Mm-hmm.
Well, sir, does trying to undermine Sun come within the activity that you've just described?
Objection.
I don't know what you mean by that.
You don't?
No.
Have you ever had discussions within Microsoft about the desirability of trying to undermine Sun because of what Sun was doing in Java?
I said to you, part of our activity is to go out and work with customers to see what it takes to have them choose to license our products, and that's in competition with many other companies, including Sun.
Would you read back the question, please?
Have you ever had discussions within Microsoft about the desirability of trying to undermine Sun because of what Sun was doing in Java?
We've certainly had discussions about making our products better than Sun's and other competitors in any area that people might think of them as desirable.
Would you read the question back, please?
Have you ever had discussions within Microsoft about the desirability of trying to undermine Sun because of what Sun was doing in Java?
Mr. Gates, there's no question pending now. Mr. Boyce is having the court reporter read back repeatedly the same question, but there's no question actually pending at the moment.
The question that was read back is pending. Mr. Heiner.
I answered that question.
Would you read back the question and the answer?
Question, have you ever had discussions within Microsoft about the desirability of trying to undermine Sun because of what Sun was doing in Java? Answer, I said to you, part of our activity is to go out and work with customers to see what it takes to have them choose to license our products, and that's in competition with many other companies, including Sun.
I'm not now talking about what you do in competition with other products or other companies. What I'm talking about is whether or not you've had discussions with people within Microsoft in which you talked about the need to undermine Sun, using those words, if that'll help you, within Microsoft.
I don't remember using those words.
You don't?
No.
Do you think you did use those words? You just don't know, one way or the other?
I don't know.
Would it be consistent with the way you felt about Java for you to have told people that you wanted to undermine Sun?